So welcome everybody to our session. As you know, it's best if you can silence your cell phones so that that's not disturbing the conversation as we move along. I want to introduce our panel, Putting Your Money Where Your Heart Is. And I'm Kate Campbell. I'm with Berkeley Investment Partners. We're sponsoring this panel. We're an independent investment firm located in North Berkeley. We focus on helping individuals and nonprofits make effective decisions about their money and how it fits into the context of their lives. And I'm here today with two authors who I'm delighted to be with. They do the work that makes what we do possible. It's kind of, I think of it as surround sound of research that feeds into the ability of my clients to actually make decisions that are meaningful. Before we dive into our material, though, I'd first like to give a shout out to Sherilyn Parsons, who is the woman who originally conceived of this festival and launched it 3 years ago. This is the third year running. And, you know, she brings together an amazing set of very gifted intellectuals and you know, the engaged and thoughtful citizenry. This year, as everything was starting to come together for the festival in the fall of 2016, as you know, we had a presidential election. And, yeah, did we end up with a president? Following the results of the election, she decided that she really needed to reorient the festival directly towards a theme not just of intellectual life, but of activism. So she refocused the festival on social justice, sustainability, and hope. And I've really appreciated that. I don't know how many sessions each of you has been able to go to so far this weekend, but it's been a really wonderful event. And so thanks to Sherilyn. And now we can get into our panel. I don't know how many of you might have attended Paul Hawkins' talk yesterday. He is part of a team. Good. He is part of a team who has just published a book called Drawdown, detailing 80 different currently available technologies, not just to mitigate, but to reduce climate change. It's really a very exciting prospect that there are so many people working on this issue. And the last two audience questions I thought were a perfect segue into what we're doing here today. The first question was, how can we change our consciousness to more effectively create transformation, the transformation in climate security that we seek? And the second question came from a young woman who was 19 and asked, you know, what advice do you have about how she could put her efforts towards making a difference? So the work that our panelists have done, I think, help answer these questions. We have with us today Clair Brown, who is a professor of economics at UC Berkeley. And she's the author of a wonderful new book, Buddhist Economics. We both have a copy because she's very generous, gave me a copy. And the subtitle is An Enlightened Approach to the Dismal Science. We also have Andy Behar, who is the CEO of As You Sow, Oakland-based foundation, and he is the author of this book about how to be a superhero, the Shareholder Action Guide, subtitled Unleash Your Hidden Powers to Hold Corporations Accountable. So that's going to be the focus of our panel today. And I'd like to start out by giving the audience a chance to understand the frameworks and where you guys are coming from with your work. Now, Buddhist economics and shareholder advocacy are really directly linked in many ways, and yet may seem like they inhabit different worlds. And I'd like to be sure that we all kind of understand where you guys have come from. Claire, can you start us off? I'm interested. You've got a couple of different models of economics that you discuss in your book, and I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how you came to work with those models and explain what those models are.
Great. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Oh,
you kind of gotta touch your chin with it. Yeah, you gotta be very close. Pretend you're like a rock star.
Rock. Okay. So, thank you for coming here. It's so wonderful to have people who are caring about other people and about the earth, as well as about how to live their lives in a meaningful way that's also secure. All of those are really important. So let me just say, if you want to understand the difference between free market economics, or sort of Trump's approach, and Buddhist economics, you want to ask the question, what makes you happy? Because that really just drives to the heart of the problem. So in free market economics, we assume people are selfish, and what makes them happy is to actually consume. To go out, get more money, and consume, and consume, and consume, and you're never satisfied. You get these momentary sort of fulfillments, but then all of a sudden you're tired of what you have, and you need more consumption, and you're off again in the rat race. And basically that's assuming that human nature is selfish and egotistical. Well, that's how we're teaching a lot of our economics. But let's go over to a more holistic approach, which many, many economists take in various ways, and I try to bring it all together and integrate it. What makes you happy in Buddhist economics is we take an Aristotle approach, and we say living a worthy life, contributing to your community, caring about other people. And the neuroscientists have shown us, when they go out and they sort of look at brainwaves, they say when people go out and care and help other people, they actually are much happier. And so we want to have basic consumption. We want to have a comfortable life. But we also want to have meaningful relationships. We want to contribute to family, community, to the world in some way, depending upon who we are and what we do. And that's how we become happy. So that tells you a lot about the two different models and the two approaches. And then you want to ask the final question, well, what do we care about social welfare? And once again, in a free market economy, we only measure social welfare by average income. We don't care about distribution or inequality. We don't even care about all these externalities, such as killing the climate, killing the environment rather, and causing global warming. So I started teaching Buddhist economics at UC Berkeley because our undergraduates kept saying, just a second, these free market models you're teaching us, we aren't figuring out inequality, we aren't figuring out global warming. We got to do more and better. I said, we know how to do that. Economists know how to do that. We just need to integrate it, bring it all together, and then we can move forward with the model that helps everyone learn to be happy, provides a comfortable, prosperous lifestyle around the world, and takes care of the environment.
Great, thank you. So, Andy.
Testing.
Yeah,
it's working.
Can you just introduce As You Sow Foundation, how you guys got started, how you got into that, and give us a little background?
Sure. Well, As You Sow has been around for 25 years. We're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary in October with a big ping pong party at Spin, if anyone would like to come. And actually, our first employee, Conrad McCarran, is sitting right over there. And it was started really to deal with corporate accountability. The basic theory of change is that corporations are the most powerful entities on the planet. If you look at governments, you look at religions, you look at corporations, the vast majority of them are corporations. So to affect change, then you need to affect the corporations to change their policies and their practices. So that's what we do. We challenge corporations. We challenge big corporations to make big changes. We recently, just this week in fact, had a very big vote at Exxon. It was actually kind of mind-bending because it was a majority vote on climate change. That when we started filing this resolution at Exxon 5 years ago, we never thought we would have this kind of power behind it. But I kind of deviate a little bit. So that's what we do. We look at corporations and we say, what's going on within the corporation? But really we're looking at it from a market standpoint, that Companies who have good environmental, social, and governance practices are going to be better companies. They're going to make more money for their shareholders. They're going to be better for the communities in which they exist. They're going to also attract better talent and retain better talent, which is the most expensive thing that a company has. So you got better workforce, better community, better, happier shareholders, and then your entire supply chain. When you look down a supply chain of a company, there's thousands of other companies. So for instance, when we filed a resolution at General Mills and said, we don't think you should be killing bees because it's going to wipe out the food system. There's a chemical called neonicotinoids. They not only agreed to do it for them, but they said, we're going to do this in our entire supply chain. So suddenly you've got thousands of companies that want to do business with General Mills. And that's really the key to it, is you can make these changes, and we own no shares. As You Sow is a small organization. We have 14 people, and we own no shares. Yet other shareholders, they authorize us to file on their behalf. We file these resolutions. We engage the companies, and we get them to change. So we see very positive change, but ultimately, it is about changing consciousness at a very high level in the C-suite and at the boards of these companies. If we can get them to wake up and see that they're part of a much bigger whole, that the changes that they make are going to benefit themselves and the planet, then you get this win-win. And the way you do it, and you get these big votes, is when you get people who are voting from their heart, from their values. And if you can manifest your values in the real world through your investments, it becomes incredibly powerful.
You know, I've been in this business for a long time, and there's a movement towards corporate social responsibility that's been underway for decades for companies themselves to electively make a decision that they want to act in what they consider to be a responsible manner for society and for the economy. And having grown out of the corporate social responsibility movement is something called a B Corp, which is a company that makes a commitment to meet certain standards in terms of meeting environmental, social, and governance goals. And the Buddhist approach, the Buddhist economics approach that you talk about, where that we can have benefit for across the range of groups. It's not about the average. It's about everybody. I link that to the concept of stakeholders that is common in corporate social responsibility and in the B Corp world. And Andy, your work is specifically with shareholders who are the currently legally designated group that has authority to make decisions. And so those of us that have been involved in social change work know that there's a very long-standing controversy, discussion about, do you work from the outside or do you work from the inside? And you're working from the inside. In a way.
We do what we call, it's an inside-outside approach, because we work very closely with grassroots groups. We believe that to make that kind of change...
tell us about the connection there.
So, sorry.
It's okay.
Off I go. We think that to make change, what we've seen is that you need to come after the corporations in 5 different vectors. Grassroots, incredibly important. That's where these ideas are boiling up from. Consumers, people who are buying, or customers, we don't even like to use the word consumer, but the customers of these companies, they have a great deal of power. The shareholders have a huge amount of power. Then there's litigation, and we file a lot of lawsuits with these companies on a whole lot range of issues and in a whole lot of ways. And then policy. Now, any one of these is not going to work on its own, and you see things get really lopsided. Like climate change was 100% policy up until 2009. Everybody said, "Oh, we're going to get cap and trade," and then when it got lost in the House and the Senate, that was it. There was no grassroots movement. There was nothing else going on, and so it was just gone. You have to coordinate these, and so, for instance, I can give you examples where we go in and we're talking to the board. And we're saying, here's an economic model. Here's a better business plan. And in the case of this Home Depot, using old growth lumber. So Rainforest Action Network, they're they're running around the stores dressed like, skunks and things, and putting banners down on the outside of the store. Home Depot is losing value in their brand. Now, meanwhile, we're inside talking to the board saying, look, old growth lumber is only 1% of our revenue. If we went to fair harvested lumber, nobody's going to notice, but we're going to preserve our brand. And a brand is estimated, I don't know exactly how they did the study, but they say 27% of a market cap of a company is its brand. So in the case of Home Depot, it was huge amount of money that they spend to maintain this brand. Anyway, they looked and they went, you're right. And they said, okay, we're going to stop using old growth lumber, and can you help us get those crazy people off the roof? Now, we don't ever officially say that we are coordinating, but there is a lot of back channel that goes on. And right now we filed resolutions with 15 different utilities all over the Midwest. We're working with every grassroots in all these little towns and all over the Midwest. So the coordination is incredibly important.
Claire, you address the issue of grassroots participation also in your book. And I know that one of your goals you've stated in conversation with me, at least, is to help people stand up in their own lives, both regarding money and beyond that. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how compassion and self-knowledge are part of the approach of this kind of the coordination Andy's talking about?
Yes. Buddhist Economics, which is based upon structured markets in all the ways you mentioned, but it starts with the individual. But the individual is interconnected with everyone else and with nature. But for so many people, given the social pressures to compete, to consume, to do all these things that don't leave us time to even think about what do I want from life, we often end up just tearing ourselves apart and saying, I didn't get far enough down my to-do list. I'm not doing all the things I should be doing. And it's like, just a minute. We want to say stop. And first of all, let's have compassion for ourselves. Let's take time to say, what do I really want from life? What makes me happy? What's meaningful to me? So we start learning compassion for ourselves. And then we already basically have compassion for our loved ones and our families, at least some of them. And then we think, how can I expand my ability to love and be kind and care about others? And it's interesting, once you learn self-compassion, once you spread out your compassion and loving kindness, it grows and it grows. And one of the really important parts of Buddhist economics is you find a community group or groups that you really want to work with. And it can be groups like As You Sow. It can be the Sierra Club. It can be 350. It can be your garden club. It can be your book club. It can be any group of individuals that you feel really good and comfortable with, and you say, let's get off the sofa. Let's get out. Let's help our communities in ways that we can do it. It's our talent. It's our skill. You figure it out. But now with climate change, and with Trump in office, we all actually have to go a step further. And that's where caring about where your money is really comes to play. We can get corporations, as Andy's shown us, to act differently, both by voting with our portfolios, but also by going out and working with individual groups and with our own community groups to demand changes. So you need all of that. We need to make demands at the local level. We need to make demands of the companies, both as consumers and shareholders, and it does make a difference. So that sort of brings it all together, from the individual to our community groups to policy to companies.
I just want to kind of give a little background here, just to make sure everybody understands, how do you actually interact with a company? Because I think a lot of people are either confused about it or don't really understand it. So if you own shares of a company, like if you own 100 shares of Apple or 100 shares of Exxon, you have rights. You can vote your proxy. So every year there's an annual meeting, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to vote on, CEO pay and all these other resolutions that that shareholders bring forward. So that's number one. If you own one share of a company, you can vote your proxy. If you own $2,000 worth of the company for a year, you can file a resolution. It's a 500-word document that you submit to the corporate secretary. It's through the SEC. It's all very official, where you can ask the company to make a change. And then all the other shareholders get to vote on it. Now, if you own most people don't own equities, like directly companies. Most people have mutual funds. They have a 401k. How many people here have a 401k, 403b mutual fund? So most people have that. And when you work at a company, generally, they'll say, here's 10 or 15 or it could be 100 different mutual funds you can pick from. And some of them are big companies, and some of them are international, and some of them are bond, and they tell you want to keep it, keep some sort of a balance between them. Now, when you own a mutual fund, you can't vote. The fund manager gets to vote. But you can choose which fund you're in. And here's the interesting thing. Most people don't actually know that a mutual fund is a basket of stocks, and that even though you may say, I hate Exxon or I'm mad at Monsanto, you may actually own them and not know it. And that's what we've found. And we've built a bunch of tools that let you go, called fossil-free funds, and you can go there and you can type in the name of your mutual fund. It'll tell you exactly every fossil fuel company that you own, and people also are confused, what does that even mean? Because there's companies that have reserves, there's companies that burn fossil fuels like utilities, there's companies that mine them like coal mining, there's pipeline companies, and there's oil field services like Halliburton. So we define all that stuff and just lay it out for you, and then we show you the carbon footprint. So we add up the carbon output of every company within a mutual fund, and we divide it by the dollar amount, so you get tons of carbon per $1 million US, and you can compare any two funds. So there's new tools that let you look inside your own investment, and it's brand new. No one's ever been able to do this, and we built it because we were involved with the Divest Fossil Fuel movement and actually working on this pledge that 50,000 people signed, that $5.2 trillion of assets signed this pledge saying we are going to divest from fossil fuels. You probably heard about Rockefeller Brothers and some big foundations doing this. And so I signed it. I helped write it. And then I realized I don't have a clue what I own. And I went and looked at my own 401k, and I realized I couldn't even figure out what was in it. It took me 2 weeks. And I found out that I had 5 mutual funds. 4 of them had Exxon, Chevron, Halliburton. We were suing Halliburton at the time. And one of them was 100% fracking companies. And we had filed resolutions against every fracking company for years. I had no idea. So we said, well, if I don't know, nobody knows. And so we built this tool to help ourselves and to help everybody and made it free. But I go into foundations, and they've got really strict sustainability and climate pledges. And yet, when you show them their own 401k has no fossil-free options, they just say, we can't go there. We can't go there. It's too difficult. And it's actually incredibly simple. We completely rebuilt ours in about 3 months.
Well, I want to recognize that it is, in fact, not that easy when you're out in the world to figure these things out. And for many years, large and small foundations have struggled with the issue of whether their investments actually match their mission, because a foundation is required to give away 5% of its assets every year in order to maintain its tax-exempt status. And that 5% of their assets every year goes towards fulfilling their mission in a very direct way. The other 95% of their assets, they often, like you, did not have any idea where that money was invested. And it's an interesting exercise to go through, and I've done this a couple times, with boards of foundations actually exploring, well, what is our brand, what is our identity, what is our mission, and what difference does it make how we invest our money? How can our investments actually support our mission? Now, you guys both do research. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, Claire, about your current research project that you started this spring with a small group of students that you mentioned to me that you intend to continue in the fall. Why don't you just share that with us?
Great. It's when my path first crossed with Andy and As You Sow. I had a group of undergraduates who cared about divestment of California's two big public pension plans, CalSTRS and CalPERS. They're extremely important because they're very big and they're very visible. And they have coal stocks. They're filled with fossil fuel stocks. And so the students came together with Fossil Free California and said, how would we analyze the financial risk of these portfolios? Because right now, there's no mandate that they include the problem of climate change in their portfolio evaluations. So and of course, CalPERS and CalSTRS, the board members cared, but the staff said, no, we know what we're doing. We don't want any input from anybody because we're the experts. We know what we're doing. And my students were clueless, but hey, they were super smart and educated and really wanted to learn. So we reached out to experts who knew a lot, like As You Sow and a couple of groups, especially in the UK. And we started thinking, how could we very simply, on a first step, analyze the financial risk when you are holding Exxon and Chevron and a lot of fossil fuel related companies. And they learned so much, they learned very quickly. We will continue our work, but the most astonishing thing is to think that we have pension plans holding coal, even coal, as well as all the other fossil fuel companies. And they say, we don't need to worry about climate change. It's not on our agenda. There is a bill working through the California legislature that would require it, but right now it's not passing immediately. So if anybody cares about these issues, and if you hold CalSTRS and CalPERS, let them know we want divestment from fossil fuel related companies.
Yeah, we work very closely with CalPERS and CalSTRS, and a lot of the big pension funds, they do not want to divest, and they have their reasons. They believe that engagement is the way, that if you divest, you're walking away from the table, and you do not have any influence over the company. Now, it's interesting, As You Sow is focused on shareholder advocacy, yet we were one of the founding groups of the divestment movement. That was quite intentional. And the reason we did that is because we needed a very far left strategy. We were getting nowhere with the oil companies, and so we actually developed the divestment concept, and we trained organizers and put them on college campuses. We wrote a book called The Divestment Handbook for Students. This was back in late 2010. And then 2 years later, 350 got involved, and they really exploded it. We had like 15 campuses, and then once Bill McKibben got involved, it like blew up to 300 campuses in a couple of months. But that was all based around this whole notion of stranded assets. I'm going to take 1 minute on stranded assets. This is kind of an underlying theory around climate change, and this was written by the Carbon Tracker Institute in England. And this came out in 2012. Basically what they did is they went into the annual reports of all the big oil companies, all the big extraction companies, and they looked at the balance sheet. Now, a balance sheet has what are known as assets on it. Assets reflected in the stock price. If you have an asset, it's an actual tangible stuff. In this case, barrels of oil, tons of coal, underground that they were going to get at in the next 15 years. So it's essentially their supply chain of what they're going to be selling over the next 15 years. If you add up all those barrels of oil and all that coal and all that material, if you were to burn it right now, you would raise the temperature of the Earth 5 degrees centigrade. We'd all be toast. So they said, well, we're never going to be able to commercialize this. 80% of this has to stay underground or we're all toast. Therefore, the stock price of all these companies is way overvalued to the tune of about, in aggregate, $20 trillion. That's the carbon bubble. That means that these companies are going to have to write off these assets. They're never going to be able to get the dollars for them. And a lot of it, you look at it, well, the price of oil is about $51 right now. It costs them about $75 or $80 to get oil out of tar sands, out of the Arctic, etc. They'll never, ever do it. In fact, Exxon just wrote down, 13 billion, barrels? So they wrote down a lot of the oil that they had on as an asset. So we So there's a lot of theory around this saying the companies are going to have to write all this stuff down. That's why holding Exxon's a bad idea. It's also they haven't made money in about, either has Chevron, in about 7 years. They spend more money searching for more oil that they're going to strand than they do on changing the nature of the company. We put a lot of pressure on them to change the company, to try to get the company to invest in other things. So if you're spending more money on looking for oil than you're making, and then you're borrowing money, you're running up debt so you can buy back stock to keep your stock price solid, and to give out dividends. Dividends are supposed to be profits. That's what's going on. It's a house of cards. And Moody's and the credit agencies are starting to see it, and there's going to be a big downgrade happening. So that's why these stocks are just really, really dangerous right now. And we wrote a paper in 2010 called The Financial Risks of Investing in Coal, and we said we thought coal would lose about half its value in the next 5 years, and we were wrong. It lost 80%. Now it's down to 90% of its value.
Hang on. Trump is going to come to the rescue
of
the coal industry.
No, it's done. Tucson Electric just signed last week 3 cents a kilowatt, a utility scale solar. You cannot get that with coal. You cannot get that with gas. It's just cheaper. Solar and wind are just cheaper.
Yeah.
And that's it. There's the market. No one's going to buy stuff that's more expensive. That's done. Coal is done.
Okay. That's a round of applause for that. I'd like to kind of follow this theme a little bit, talking about power, or POWA, as Dacher Keltner was talking about earlier today. He was, really talking about the ways in which altruistic and empathic behavior of people who don't have systemic power can rise to a position of power or leadership. And I think about shareholder advocacy and the ability of somebody who owns 100 shares or $2,000, whatever it might be, to really prompt a discussion among the shareholders of a company, and combined with the coordination that you do with other institutional shareholders, may be a true conversation, even if it's not held at the level of the ballot itself, but it goes on behind the scenes, ahead of the ballot, after the ballot, before the second resolution, and on. And but there is we have some new legislation before us right now, the Financial Choice Act. I don't know if anybody's heard about, if you're familiar with the rules that were passed after the last financial meltdown, that the administration now feels are too onerous to corporations, and so they're trying to roll back those rules. And a piece of it is changes to the ability of shareholders to have a voice in the management of their companies. And some of the language in the document is really disturbing. I went, after talking with Andy a couple weeks ago, I went and read some of this. They said that they need to limit the ability of small shareholders to file these resolutions because they are embarrassing the leadership of the company, and they're interfering with the ability of the company to responsibly guide their efforts in the world. So we are stopping responsibility with these. And I wondered if, Andy, if you could talk a little bit about what those specific regulations are and how likely you think it is that this is actually going to make it through in the final bill.
Sure. I'm just going to give people like a little context, and because Conrad's here, and just an example of how the system works, and then why companies are trying to take it away. So back in 2006, Conrad did a whole report on how companies use plastics. Coke, Nestle Water, Pepsi, all of the bottling companies, what they do with their plastics. And he found that none of them really had any recycling going on at all. They all got very low grades. So he called them up and said, hey, here's the results of this survey. He spent a long time doing it and sat down with them, and they kind of ignored it. And Yeah, that's interesting. So filed a resolution, and now it became in the media. Coke, Pepsi, they were all really embarrassed because they got these Ds or Fs or C minuses. And so we got some votes. They came around. What's happened through the negotiations, through the actual engagement, that's the important thing, is that we engage the companies. We actually have relationships with them. Together, in aggregate, it's about 70 billion plastic bottles a year that are being recycled, that are being kept out of landfills, out of oceans. He did the same thing with McDonald's. Just 2 years ago, they were still using styrofoam cups. And through negotiations, and then when they ignored him, filing the resolution, 770 million fewer styrofoam cups are going into landfills. So these are real tangible things. So I just want you to kind of get that. And when you file a resolution, you can then come back the next year, and we're very tenacious. It takes a lot of years to do it. So what this Financial Choice Act is, it's actually the rollback of Dodd-Frank. So in 2008, after the financial meltdown, the Volcker rule was put in place, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that Elizabeth Warren headed up, as well as there's rules around using conflict minerals, so slavery in your supply chain, basically. So there's a lot of rules around that now, and we worked very closely with the whole electronics industry to get those rules written on the supply chain, and the companies actually like it. Now that it's in place, it took 5 years to get the rules in place, and now we've had 3 years of the companies reporting it. The companies, Apple looks at it and goes, this is a great way for us to point at one document and say, we do not have slavery in our supply chain. So they decide they're going to roll back Dodd-Frank because they want to have another 2008 meltdown, or Goldman Sachs is in charge and they just don't want to have any kind of restrictions. And they decided to throw shareholder rights into it as well. It was not part of Dodd-Frank, but the Business Roundtable led by Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, they've been trying to take away the rights of shareholders for years. And so they threw it in there, and now it's going to be voted on by the House on June 7th. We've been working really closely with Indivisible. So I don't know if you guys know what Indivisible is, but Indivisible is brilliant. They use the tactics of the Tea Party. If you go to indivisible.org or .com, actually, you type in your zip code, there's 6,000 Indivisible groups around the country. There is one within 5 or 10 miles of everybody. They're the people who are throwing the town halls. Every time there's a recess from Congress, they either have a town hall where the representative shows up, or they have what they call an empty chair town hall where they don't show up, and they still have the conversation, but then it gets published in the local newspaper that the guy was, afraid to show up. Very effective tool. And so we've been sending shareholders to all of those to say, hey, but the repeal of Dodd-Frank has not been in the newspaper at all. Probably no one's heard of it. I mean, it's all over. That's all we're like all over this because of the shareholder rights being rolled back. But what would happen is, I mentioned $2,000. You need $2,000 of stock to file. If this goes through, you would need to file at Apple next year. You'd need $8 billion. So it would significantly cut back on the number of shareholder resolutions this year.
And that's a 1%.
It's 1%
position.
Yeah. So there were 470 resolutions filed this year. If this goes through next year, there'll probably be none, maybe one. Then that would be significant impact on people who want to vote, and also on these are very positive resolutions. These help companies. We shareholders are like the first line of defense, showing companies where there's risk. We get them to actually avoid risk because we own the companies. And so we think what's going to happen is it'll get passed in the House. The Senate will filibuster it because of the Consumer Financial Protection Act, Bureau. And then we'll see what happens if they split it apart. But they don't like it. And I think they're just afraid. I think that we've been targeting now, and I say we, I mean the whole community. I mean, there's $62 trillion in assets out there that we talk to in terms of organizing for votes. That's globally, and that's all these pension funds. It's all over. It's all the big mutual funds. And we actually saw BlackRock, Vanguard, the big mutual funds vote at Exxon and at Occidental Petroleum for the first time. They voted 99% of the time with management historically. We called them out as carbon hypocrites. We actually use that phrase. And but they voted for these resolutions, which got a majority. And I think there's a lot of fear that these boards are going to be replaced, because after a majority vote, if they don't do what's been asked, then there's going to be a lot of people are going to get voted off the board.
And that could be some positive change. Claire?
But I think the shareholder activism is extremely critical and it has accomplished a lot. But let me just say, if we want to stop global warming, we have got to price carbon. We have to follow everything that California is doing and ensure it continues. We have to have the fuel standards continue. And we need to follow everything that's happening in California, because we are now the leader in the United States, and it's making a huge difference. And the other states can join in, and I think will start joining in as the nation recedes. So Trump is isolating himself, but we don't have to be isolated. California doesn't have to be isolated, or New York, or any of the states or localities, because that's where the action is. So let me just remind you that when Chevron and Exxon and the oil companies say, oh, we can't have fuel standards because people want to drive their SUVs and pickup trucks, it's actually true. In California, more people are buying SUVs and pickup trucks. So we have to say, first of all, as individuals, and in our own neighborhoods and communities, we have to stop buying gas guzzlers, and we have to drive less. And then we have to go one more step, and when the dairy industry and the cattle industry say, oh no, people really have to have their beef and their cheese and all of their things that are actually really hurting the earth again, we need to say, okay, we're actually willing to cut back on how much meat we eat, and we're actually also willing to eat a lot less beef and lamb and cheese, because those things are, in fact, the CO2 emissions are enormous. And you can read, if you read my book, you'll see the references and the charts and so on, and you can go look them up. But those are the two things that we need to do to fight back against the industry push to say, oh no, we're just giving consumers what they want. They want meat. They want gas guzzlers. We have to say, no, consumers also care enormously about the climate and about global warming. We want to give them clean air, clean water, and we want to give them a future generation that we pass on to our children and grandchildren. So it all has to come together, but we need the policies as well as the shareholder activism if we want to make the changes we need now. We can do it, but we have to do it now, right away.
But the markets are also, I mean, you look at Ford and GM are not going to be able to sell cars into China or to India, because if they follow on, if they don't, if they do what Trump is asking, they're going to basically just like hurt themselves, hurt their shareholders, and basically isolate themselves. So, and the rest of the world's looking at it and going like, fine, the Chinese are just totally thrilled. They can go and build all this infrastructure. I mean, they're closing coal plants faster than they're putting up wind and solar. So it is happening. It is definitely happening.
On a local level, Claire, can you talk a little bit about what you know about the Chevron refinery in Richmond and community efforts to engage them in change?
I have to tell you that among the oil companies, Chevron's probably the worst in responding to community and to shareholders. They really fight back. Exxon isn't great, but they're a little bit more responsive, and also Exxon, hid their scientific reports from the last 3 decades. So you can go read Stop Exxon. But in Chevron, I live in Point Richmond. Hey, I live right by Chevron. And we cared enormously, not just about CO2 emissions, which heat the earth, but we care enormously also about what we call the co-pollutants, like especially particulate matter, SOx and NOx, the things that are making our kids have horrible asthma and be quite ill. So we tried working with Chevron. And Chevron said, no, everything's fine. We're within boundaries, but we'd say, can we see the data? And they say, well, there's a certain amount of data you can see. Here it is, but you can't see the rest of the data. And so we started doing, besides trying to work with Chevron directly, we started working, and this was 350 in Sierra Club that I was working with, but a bunch of groups. We started working with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which is in charge of the pollution controls. They're the people who tell you when we have Spare the Air, for example. And we said we need local caps on the co-pollutants as well as the total CO2 emissions that are under cap and trade. And they hummed and hawed. This went on for 5 years. But the good news is that just this last week, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District the board voted to say we are going to require local caps on local air pollution in addition to the statewide CO2 emissions, because Chevron was planning to actually start using really much dirtier oil and causing a lot more local pollution, which we should all care about, actually, because it not just in Richmond, it blows all over El Cerrito and Albany and Berkeley, too. So that's a huge, big breakthrough where it was social activism getting the local pollution caps that we know will really help the health of the people who live in the Bay Area, especially the East Bay. So that was one great breakthrough, but it didn't come easy. It didn't come because Chevron said, yeah, we understand. It came because we had to really fight for it for 5 years.
Thank you for being part of that fight. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit and bring in a gender lens on these issues that we've been talking about. Earlier in the conference, there have been numerous references to the impact that, in particular, education of women can have globally on climate change, and the way in which keeping girls in school longer enables them to make a different set of decisions that affect families and communities in far-reaching ways. And I'm curious if you could each talk a little bit about, in your work, the kinds of things you see where gender makes a difference.
Sure. We're actually developing a site like Fossil Free Funds that's going to be called Gender Equity Funds. So you'll be able to go and plug in your mutual funds that you own. It'll tell you how many women are on the board, what percentage of women are on the board. The data sets don't exist right now. We might have to do it. But for ranking each company by, do they actually have fair pay for equal work? Do they have maternity policies? Just other gender-based policies. So there's not a lot of data out there right now. So that's one thing. Just in a quick scan of it, we built a little pilot. I can tell you that if you want to have 30% women on the board, now, that always confused me. I looked at that because in Europe there's this whole 30% coalition, and there's certain countries that say you have to have 30% women on the board. It's a requirement. I was like, why not 50? Where's this number coming from? It actually comes out of research that shows that when you have one woman on the board, it's tokenism. 2, well, they can at least have a second in terms of putting a proposal forward. But 3 women on the board actually starts to shift the culture of the company. So whenever we vote, our proxies in our guidelines, we say you have to have at least 3 women on the board and 30%, or we vote against the whole board. And then next year it'll be 40, and then it'll be 50, and that's where we're going to hang. But if you were to put that lens on the S&P 500, you'd have to exclude 444 companies. So 444 companies do not have 30% women on the board. Only one company has 50% women on the board, and it's unfortunate which one it is because they're being sued for doing terrible things. It's called Navient, and they are the whole student loan scandal. So it's unfortunate, I know, but if you had a 50% screen, you can only buy one company in the S&P 500. So it's getting a little better. Exxon put one woman on the board, a climate competent woman. We've been demanding climate competence. She is a climate scientist, but it's slow, and it shouldn't be so tough because I know we just added to our 401k plan a mutual fund that has all women CEOs, and that's generally the companies with women CEOs outperform. And this particular fund, a PAX fund, do you know what it's called? I forget the name of it.
I don't know if that's the Global Sustainability Fund that took over the PAX Elevate Fund.
Yeah, PAX Elevate Fund, yeah. So anyway, there are mutual funds that are focused on gender, and they tend to outperform. So,
well, before you respond, Claire, I just want to mention that in the finance industry, of which I am apart. There is approximately 25% women in the industry as a whole, and that includes at every level. And at the management level, it's, of course, a much lower percentage. And so I'm curious, Claire, about your world, where that stands.
Right. Well, when you just say education, in the rich countries, women are being educated. And in fact, in the U.S., there's an education problem with men. And so let's not talk about education in rich countries. As you said, we educate women well. It's the leadership roles that you're talking about, not really education. But now what's becoming a problem in the rich countries, and let's just say the U.S., point blank, is women's health care. So that women really have special and enormous health care needs because of childbearing and being able to control our childbearing. And that's really an important thing that's at stake. If you look at the poor world, the developing world, but I just want to call it the poor world because they're so developed in some ways, just not economically. What happens is if you increase education and if you increase health care, that is the quickest way to, first of all, lower population growth, but really improve the quality of life and the economy. So if you want to do anything, it's both education and health care. It's both of those going together in the poor world. But the main thing you need also is to add in human rights, because women around the world in the developing world need much broader human rights and the ability to participate in politics. And so there are in the UN, in the Sustainable Goals, there are some wonderful indices about women's participation in life in each country. And so if you care about that at all, you can go online and look at UN Sustainable Goals and learn a lot about in what countries are women participating in just even being able to be elected and to get educated as well as to own property. So there are lots of different problems that we're talking about all rolled into what we call education, healthcare, and human rights. But they're all really an important part of any economy that's performing well.
I'm going to ask one final question of the panelists, and then we're going to turn it open for questions. And that is, can you each talk a little bit about the future that you envision in a world that incorporates the Buddhist framework of economics and a type of shareholder advocacy where corporations are responsive to the community conversation? We're looking for some positive visions here.
Well, I'm the total optimist. I mean, I just am. I just see that the people are rising. I mean, this week to see a majority vote at Exxon on climate, and then to have Trump withdraw himself from this international pact to actually be the only other country that we're with is Syria. Nicaragua, everybody keeps talking about, but Nicaragua actually thinks the Paris Agreement is too weak. So they want to go even more. And then you see, President Jerry Brown of the United States of Climate make a deal with New York and Washington, and he's in China right now. And every mayor and every city and every company, including Exxon, is saying, we're going to keep to our climate promises. I see it in just saying, okay, the U.S. is going to meet their climate goals. And Michael Bloomberg wrote a check, said, here's the U.S. has to contribute to help other countries. So I look at this and go, this is great. This is really motivating. People who'd never gotten out on the streets are out there. That 2018, we're going to win back the House. That this pendulum swing, it was just a temporary thing. But it's taken this thing to get us all motivated. And it's not just, Berkeley is a bubble within a bubble within a bubble. California is a bubble. Northern California is a bubble, and Berkeley is really a bubble. But there are people across the country who are just really not happy. I don't know, how many of you heard the mayor of New Orleans talk about removing the statue? If you haven't, go and listen. This is really the conversation around race is finally happening. It really didn't happen during Obama's administration. There was, a lot of There were all these, race riots and a lot of people getting killed by a military police force. This removal of these statues and this conversation, there's a lot of just festering stuff that's coming out. So I am optimistic that the people are going to turn out and vote, because that's what happened. I mean, look, 50% of the people turned out, and barely half of them, a little less than half, voted for Trump. So we're talking about a quarter of the people. So if we all actually turned out and voted, it just would be completely, let's take this thing back.
Claire?
Well, I'm also an optimist, so maybe we needed a pessimist on our panel. But
Oh, well.
yeah. So actually, on my website, BuddhistEconomics.net, I blog a lot about sort of what's happening and the current problems and what our response might be. But let me tell you what I think our focus really needs to be, and that is on what's the quality of life. And not just for an average person, but for everybody, and not just in the United States, but around the world. And the minute we start asking, what's the quality of life, how can we stop global warming, and how can we create peace and prosperity around the world, then we're all of a sudden in a conversation where we can continue coming together. I agree. It's like, I thought, to be honest, the United States, we're just way too consumer-oriented, and economic growth is just more and more to consume. And that with Trump, we just it's like the drunk hitting rock bottom. And all of a sudden, we realize, you know what? This is not okay. Our lives are endangered. The way we want to live is endangered. We are out in the streets, as you said. And that's a huge improvement. But I think we have to go a step further, and we have to say, just a second, we're working way too hard to have time for families and communities that we really want a balanced life. And especially this goes for young people. And there are a few young people here, but I think we have to keep asking, how can we think holistically? And so in my book, I talk about how can we measure economic performance, not just as consumption, but as all the things that we care about, our experiences, how we spend our leisure time, how hard we're working, who's not able to work because they're unemployed, and what are we doing to the environment, and bring it all together in a measure of economic performance that's holistic. Now, by the way, economists know how to do that. We just aren't doing it. Economists know also each country picks their inequality. Nobel laureates have shown us that. Each country picks their carbon emissions. We know that. And you know what? We know how to have shared prosperity. We know how to stop putting CO2 into the air. And we also know how to move forward together. So it's just a matter of, once again, continuing this discussion. To me, the dialogue and the discussion and rallying and going and engaging with companies and protesting is really important. But together, we can do so much, as well as stop having gas guzzlers and eating meat. We can do it all together.
Thank you both. So we have a mic here for folks in the audience that'd like to ask questions. Why don't we start with this guy here in the first row?
Hello? Thank you very much. And I could ask a million, but I'm just going to ask one. The we, just tying in, ma'am, Claire, this is directed toward you. The we, the context is Masa Gessen spoke with Orville Schell yesterday, extremely depressing, her view of the world. But the we, what I see is we've got to get the Trump voters. It's not just us. I'm from Santa Rosa. I lived in Berkeley, but it's a different world out there. I'm going to go out and I'm going to be seeing the homeless in Santa Rosa, huge problem. How do we get to the we? How do we get to not just, that is the question. How do we get to the we?
Right. Well, I grew up in Tampa, Florida, and I know lots of Trump voters, and I actually have family in Oklahoma. I know even more Trump voters. And the interesting thing is they are very well-intentioned. They are feeling left behind, and that's because it's focused on the average, with 80% of all economic growth going to the top 5% in this country. For 20 years this has happened. They have been left behind. And you know what? We weren't paying any attention to that. So I think that we need to be able to reach out and really be in touch with their suffering, because they have suffered. Their towns are demolished in many areas. They have unemployment, and they don't know what to do with it. We know how to bring in local economic development. We know how to help them move ahead if we wanted to. So I think our first thing is to be in touch with them. And the second is to help them so that they don't focus on their tribalism, which, hey, I'm from Tampa, I know all about tribalism, and to help them see that they can have a better world, that they can have jobs that are meaningful to them, that they can feel good about themselves again, because they feel like they aren't contributing anything to their families, or they just feel really bad about themselves. And we need to think very seriously about how to work across the country and not just have all the wealth be on the two coasts. I think their criticism is valid, and that we're all smart and sensitive and caring people, and actually they are too. As long as we can just move them past their tribalism and forget about the bottom 10%, the alt-right. Just ignore the alt-right. There's nothing you can do about the alt-right. I'm talking about the rest of the people who are suffering.
I have a question here in the front row.
Thank you. I do have a question, but I also wanted to mention another win we had this week here in Berkeley, where the City Council voted unanimously to divest from Wells Fargo. The renewal of the contract was up this last Wednesday, and they were going to get a divorce. It's going to take a year, but and they're also forming a socially responsible banking committee to come up with criteria for selecting the next banking partners. So just wanted to mention that. But my question is for Andrew, and this is on, I'm really excited to hear about your fossil-free fuels tool, and you mentioned about also looking into having another analytic tool for gender equality. And I wondered, I mean, there's so many other things that could be analyzed. For instance, the prison complex, also rainforest deforestation, especially with palm oil, human slavery in the supply chain, tobacco, CEO and rank and file inequality, pay rates.
You've obviously been looking at our website, because deforestation-free funds exists, and that is all about palm oil. So you'd look at every mutual fund, and it would tell you the palm oil producers, the banks that fund them, and the companies that use them. We work closely with Friends of the Earth and with Rainforest Action Network on that one. We work with the Quakers on the prison systems. So we have a prison-free funds. Hasn't been launched in our template, but they track about 70 companies that are part of the prison industrial complex and the mass incarceration. We work with MIT on weapons, so companies that make nuclear weapons, cluster munitions, and landmines. Tobacco-free funds will be launched in about 3 weeks. It's actually done. I just tested it last week. And then the gender funds. All of this is really funding dependent. We're a nonprofit, so like I said, we made a deal with the Quakers. They're putting all of their research about the companies. It's in our database now, and we're sending them back the data for their site. Same thing with MIT. So we're building it out, but we just do it in phases, because as we get grants, we will roll this out. We're trying to find a funder for the gender work right now, because again, it's just. But ultimately, we will be building a know what you own platform, where you'll go there, you'll express what your values are, and then it will look at your portfolio, and it will be able to say, this is how you could decarbonize. I care about whatever your values are, and it'll tell you.
One of the most important ones is the CEO and rank and file pay disparity.
Yeah, we put out a report every year called the 100 Most Overpaid CEOs that you can get on our site. It's on asyousow.org. All these reports are free. And an interesting thing, we've been doing it for 3 years, and when you look at the 100 most overpaid CEOs of the S&P 500, though that group underperformed the rest of the S&P by 4%. The top 10, the most egregiously overpaid CEOs, underperformed by 10% with a negative 5% return. So people are actually looking at it and using it as an investment strategy, that if you underweight the companies that overpay their CEOs, you actually make a lot more money in terms of as a stockholder. So it's interesting.
Sorry, a couple more questions. I just want to be sure we get in as many as we can. In the blue, and then this lady in the white up here, and then back over here.
Hi. If I understand things right, managers of government pension funds and private pension funds can only use financial criteria to make their decision. So they can only be convinced to look into, human rights abuses if it's actually an excess risk factor. I'm wondering whether you think it makes sense for something ready after the next crisis, or the Bernie Sanders hypnotizes everybody, for the devolution of power to the contingent beneficiaries of pension funds, people who are going to be alive in 30 years and want to actually breathe the air, for example, or drink clean water, or have a sense of connection to community. And whether you think a kind of extended democracy in that way is just opening the Pandora's box of corruption and weird dealings, or whether you think that's a constructive idea.
The definition of materiality is what you're actually kind of circling around, because companies must, they have to tell their shareholders things that are material. And so I believe if the people who are putting money into the pension system actually care about an issue and they actually go and petition, like up at CalPERS, I mean, their investment committee is very, very open, although they're very strict. It takes time to get through to them. And I think on any of these issues, if there is material risk, then it should be explained to them, and that they should be either underweighting or engaging. I mean, that's their thing. They've, the CalPERS story and how they engage with companies.
Okay, I kind of want to put you on the spot. Do you think non-financial criteria should be legally allowed through changes in ERISA or whatever the rules are?
I don't know you'd have to define what non-financial means, because if a company has slavery in their supply chain.
You present to a beneficiary who's just getting vested but is going to get a payout in 30 years. And you ask them, how important is financial criteria? How important is this? We think this is that. Here's a report on how much it's going to cost the fund and your payout, or the probability that you're going to get your defined benefits, or whatever the hell they are, with this or that set of trade-offs. People are supposed to be stupid about money, but
I want to make a little bridge here, because there is an assumption that if you pay attention to non-financial criteria, or criteria that are maybe have a dual identity on both the financial and the social side, that you're giving up financial return as
and the criteria for,
and we think it's just the opposite.
And so I just want to make a little bridge there, and that's part of the reason why the ERISA guidelines and prudent man investing and all that don't include non-financial criteria. So I just want to recognize that there's actually, I want to pull in something. I'm sorry, I'm totally hijacking your question. I want to pull in something that you, Andy and I talked about earlier, which was that people are afraid of their money. And they're afraid to make investing decisions because they don't know what the consequences will be. So will it open up the door, a Pandora's box of shenanigans around scaring people about what the consequences will be in terms of their financial security down the road, or in terms of the terrible social consequences? Anyway, I'm pushing it back to you, because
I see companies.
No, you have
I see companies that have poor environmental, social, and governance policies as not being as sustainable, financially sustainable in the long term. The companies that have slavery in their supply chain, that are ignoring environmental violations, there's just more risk inherent. And also, the managers of those companies are generally people who just don't care about risk. And I think that ultimately there's financial, you can't parse the two is really the problem. So, but I don't know.
There's conflicts between, for example, If you hate
Do you mind if we just keep going here? Or
I think we should move on to the next one.
If you hate sleazy
come
bankers,
afterwards and let's keep going on this.
But there's clearly conflicts like sleazy bankers but nice to women. That or a criterion about women.
It's a problem.
That
Wells Fargo, we filed a resolution on the Dakota Access Pipeline with Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and Wells Fargo. And, we actually got some movement with Morgan Stanley.
Can I just add something that, as an economist, really bothers me in that you've mentioned studies, both of you, and I have a bunch listed in my book where companies who have more equal pay between management and workers, companies who have better human resources management and so forth, all these, they're just study after study that show those companies, their stock performs better, their productivity goes up, they're actually healthier companies financially. And you know how much difference that makes? Zero in terms of until they're really pushed by either activists, shareholders, or whatever. So it's like we know, we've done all this research, and the companies ignore it unless they're pushed. And it's ignored by the financial people making the decisions to buy the stock. It's like they're looking at some kind of short-term bottom line when all of these other studies are showing just a second. The financial risk to these companies and their ability to, over the next 5 to 10 years, perform well, you're ignoring it. So it's like, I think we need to think about, we know a lot, and we should be applying it. And that's what As You Sow is trying to do.
So let's move on to the next question.
Hi. Thank you. It's a really interesting panel. I want to ask you a question about divesting from fossil fuel stocks and all those other good screens versus investing in green energy. As a progressive who is not making much money, because I'm doing all my good progressive work, but has a little money to invest, I need to invest somewhere where it performs well. And so far, unless I'm missing something, wind and solars is not doing well. And I wonder if I am missing something, or whether you think things are going to turn around as it gets cheaper and cheaper. I'd like to invest in green energy.
I think you need to broaden your definition of what is clean, what clean tech means. We publish a report called Redefining Cleantech for that very reason, because it's not just wind and solar. There's a lot of IT. There's a lot of sensor systems. Like, imagine a company makes a sensor that you can... We define clean tech as any service or product that reduces demand for fossil fuels or water. So an IT company that makes a little sensor that you put all over your field, and it tells you don't water the south side because it's already wet over there. Saves you water. I mean, just that company is going to be worth so much money in 10 or 20 years. Companies that make LED lights, companies that make... we also publish a thing called the Clean 200 list. So the opposite of the Carbon Underground 200 that I described before, which is those 200 biggest reserves, every 6 months we put out a new list. And what we do is we take the Bloomberg New Energy Finance numbers. We take companies that are only over $1 billion market cap. We get rid of all the companies that are just, you'd screen out in a socially responsible portfolio. And then we put them in order. And very interesting, the last one that we did had 25 countries represented. China was 70% of it. 35% of it, 70 Chinese companies. They were the smaller companies, though. They were companies making like smart meters. But a lot of the companies that are doing this are putting smart technology into existing things. So Nest, a smart thermostat turns off your heat. You don't use as much gas. Those kind of companies are the ones that I think are going to be worth a lot of money. And so when you compare the Carbon Underground 200 versus the Clean 200, and we back time to 10 years, you made 300% more with the clean ones. You don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we just keep tracking this stuff. And so, and there's a lot of people using that. They're building indexes. There's a ton of new investing portfolios. Well, the Carbon Underground 200 is the list of the 200 companies that when you sign the pledge that you're saying you're going to divest from. The 100 largest oil and 100 largest gas company, 100 largest coal companies, 100 largest oil companies.
So you can clearly see that the As You Sow website is going to be a terrific resource for you. We have one more question I'd like to get thrown out there. Nope. Oh, it is 4:30. It's true. So for those of you that have questions and would like to continue the conversation, please come down and stick around afterwards. And Claire, Andy, thank you both so much.
Thank you.